Welcome to the Code with Jason meetup. I'll share my screen and get us going. Okay, so here's the situation. I feel like these sessions are requiring more and more explanation as the product matures. Um, Recently, I made a certain change, and let me get something going here. Okay, I'm gonna revert this commit I just made because I think it introduced a bug. Okay. No, that's not going to work. Okay, let me commit that and then push. Okay. And then I will um sorry, bear with me a second here. Okay, so I made this change to the system for the sake of performance. Um Before, when you would kick off a test run, it would make an API call to DigitalOcean and spin up some virtual machines, one for each runner you have. You can pick however many runners you want to run in parallel so your test suite runs faster. Um, but you would start the test run and it would request some virtual machines from DigitalOcean. Those machines would get provisioned, and then once the machines came online, the test suite would start running. The problem is that provisioning step takes a while. It can take like a minute or more. And so that's a lot of overhead. That's like a minute of the test run where your tests aren't actually being run. And I had a customer who I was getting onboarded, and his test suite was taking about 20 minutes to run, um, which was better than it was. It was taking like 25, 30 minutes, and I made some certain improvements and got it down to about 20 minutes. But he could get as little as like 15 minutes on GitHub Actions. And so it needed to be at least as good as GitHub Actions. And so I changed how it works. Instead of a VM getting requested when you kick off a test run, I made it so there's just a pool of VMs just always sitting at the ready. And when you start a test run, it doesn't initialize new VMs, it just grabs some existing VMs. And then let's say it grabs two, it'll grab those two and then provision two more for next time. So if there's always some in the pool. Um, and that has been working great. But then I did a little bit of refactoring and I introduced a bug. And so that's what I want to address today. And we'll get into exactly what the bug is. I'm actually not even sure what the bug is. We'll get into what the symptoms are at least. Um, okay, so what I did just a minute ago was I provisioned a couple new VMs. The term I use for these VMs is test runners. All right, so we can see that there are supposedly five test runners that are in the ready state. This is a weird inconsistency. I think this is part of the bug. This runner is at the ready state, is in the ready state, but it also has been assigned a run, which is like that doesn't make sense together. So I don't know what's up with that. Um, and then these four are like really in the ready state. Okay, so I mentioned that I did some refactoring and I think introduced a bug. I reverted that refactoring. And so now things might work correctly, except we still have this many VMs left over from from the possibly buggy state. So if I start a test run now, it actually might not work. But let's see what happens. I'll just rerun this and I'll delete this one that's like stuck and running that's never going to finish. Okay, so if this actually is working, we should see something under system logs right now. And we don't. Not for either of them. Okay. And so Again, here we have these four in the ready state. If we refresh this list, let's see what happens. Okay, so we see that these two have a run ID, but they're still in the ready status. Again, that's inconsistent. Yeah. So,
And you have one that's assigned without a run ID now.
oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so that's no good. Um, and what's unclear is whether there's a bug now still, or if this is just leftover symptoms from when that bug was present. So what I want to do is like clear out all these runners and start over fresh, so we can determine whether there's a bug present now or not. I'm going to delete this run. I'm going to see if that had any effect on what we have here. Okay, those run IDs went away. Um, so part of what I often do when I'm fixing a bug is I don't attack the bug directly, but I work on some things to make the bug diagnosis more easy and convenient. Maybe provide more like observability into the system so I can more effectively diagnose the bug. And right now, there's a problem that makes bug diagnosis difficult. I don't have an easy way uh, to delete runners. I'll show you how inconvenient it is. So if I want to delete this one, I give them random unique names. So if I want to delete toxic salad, I can grab the ID of this one and say test runner find by abbreviated hash. This hash um, dot destroy. Actually, it's even worse than that. I think I have to do deprovision. Okay, so let's see if that worked. Okay, so toxic salad is gone. So that's great, but that's annoying. And I would have to do that for now all five of these remaining ones. What would be much nicer, I have this CLI tool, um, and it's a little bit, these credentials here obscure it, but this is the main part of the CLI tool, SaturnCI test runners. It'd be nice if I could do something like SaturnCI test runner that delete. It'd be nice if I could do that and just delete these test runners via the command line. So let's get something like that going. If I just hit enter, oh, interesting. Yeah, it doesn't do the right thing. Not surprisingly. So let's add the ability to delete a test runner via the command line. Okay, so the CLI, I call it the Saturn CLI, the Saturn CI CLI, and here's where it takes the arguments. We just have the case statement that parses it. But this case statement is getting a little nasty. So before we add another thing and make it even worse, maybe we can clean up this code that parses the command. Excuse me. Um, okay, so how do we want to do that? Maybe we can have a second, or maybe we can have an additional class that represents the arguments.
Did
Yeah.
you want a second class to represent the text of the arguments, or are you just looking for like a being able to map the arguments to a class.
The former.
Okay.
Yeah, so Saturn CLI, let's call it arguments dot RB. And then we can move the body of this method into arguments. And then where does this execute method get called? Here. Okay, so maybe I can do this. Yeah, there we go. All right. So now I imagine if I run all my tests, we'll get some failures. Oh, it says zero example, zero failures. Oh, wrong folder. Oh, I'm confused. Okay, spec Saturn CI CLI. Okay. Okay. Yep, we get some failures, which is good because that's what I expected. So if I fix these changes that I just made, then we should see these failures go away. All right, so I changed it just now. Before client.execute would take the raw arguments. Now, oh yeah, now it should take the arguments object. All right, so let's write some tests for the arguments class itself. And I will open up the test for client so we can get an idea for how these tests are written. Okay, so do we already have some that we have some tests related to parsing arguments? Looks like we don't even have that. Okay. So first, I'm not even going to worry about writing a test that particularly makes sense. I'm just going to say it works. And then I'll say arguments. Sure, there we go. Um, but let's do something even simpler. Um, test runners. Yep. I expect that this will fail. Yeah, uninitialized constant Saturn CI CLI. So this is not in the right namespace. Okay, what do we get next? Oh, we're not even including this file. Okay, undefined local variable or method argument. Arguments line 3. Yeah, this is obviously not even in a method. I don't know what this is going to be called. I don't know, parse or something like that. Wrong number of arguments. We need initialize. Okay, now that test passes. What if we run all the CLI tests? Still get failures, unsurprisingly. Okay. Um, so we're getting this arguments argument here, but we're not doing anything with it, obviously. So we'll have to fix that. Okay. So let's take one example. Um, Test runners. Let's take that example. So when it's test runners, we just call this test runners method. Hmm. How do we get from having an argument? Okay, so like we start with a raw argument, we don't know what it is, and then we get to a point where we have an argument and we do know what it is, but then how do we get from there to actually executing something? Hmm. I think this example is actually too simple. Let's take this one where there's some more going on. So we have this run argument, and then we grab like the run ID from it. I think what we need is like the action that it maps to and the arguments.
Might this be a good use of yielding to a block?
Good question. Where would that block come from?
Oh, it seems like the logic to do the work for the most part is in your client RB, if I'm reading that correctly.
Yep.
Um, so it might be good to keep the logic or the actual execution in client RB, but allow the arguments to tell you which block to call, if that makes sense.
Setting blocks or no blocks aside for a second, I completely agree. I think that's exactly the right idea. Um, yeah, like right now, for example, SSH, I want to keep this SSH behavior inside the client class. I certainly don't want to move it to arguments because that would be inappropriate. Um, so how, for example, do we go from knowing we want to SSH into something to actually invoking this SSH method? And maybe what you're proposing for consideration is that we might take like this piece of behavior and that takes the form of a block in the client class, and the block gets invoked from here.
Yeah, so kind of what I was envisioning would be for this to yield what the intended action is from the arguments
Mm-hmm.
and any positional arguments that are appropriate for that action. Does that make sense? So in this case, we
Yeah.
would just return like run as a symbol with run ID as the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have a much more simple case statement in your uh, client class to see,
Right.
okay, when it's run, here's the method to call. We already have the arguments parsed out. Call that with those arguments. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that well?
Yeah, I think I'm with you, and I think I agree. Let me take this chunk of code like line by line a second. Um, so run ID equals argument dot split. Oh, let's actually fix this because I'm already a little confused. Argument, arguments. Okay. Run ID equals arguments dot split, and then we
You
take the
have a
first
few
one.
double S's in your arguments.
Oh no. Wow. Okay. Let's do that a different way. There we go. Thanks.
Yep.
Um, okay, so this is a matter of parsing text. That is clearly the responsibility of this arguments class. Connection details. To me, that's clearly not a responsibility of the arguments class. And then calling this SSH method, also not a responsibility of the arguments class. The arguments object should parse the arguments, but it shouldn't be deciding what to do with the parsed arguments. Okay. Connection details. Why was this ever happening where it was? Okay. Hmm. Interesting. Excuse me. Okay. So connection details. I think maybe I shouldn't ever have been doing this the way that I was. Um, Let me do something. I'm actually going to stash all this. Um, okay. So what if I feel like this refactoring might be easier if we do a certain smaller piece of refactoring first. So what if for connection details, we actually do that inside here? But now we need to know, hmm, I'm noticing yet another problem. So I'm going to undo all that. We have some outdated code here. So the domain model has kind of shifted. Um, in the past, in the past, all I had was runners, and they each were running a run, and I could SSH into those. But then I changed a bit, and now we have this concept of a test runner. And so now where before there were just runs, and you would SSH into a runs VM, now there's this additional concept of a test runner, and you don't SSH into the runs VM, you SSH into the runs test runners VM. And so this idea here of SSHing into a run, that is outdated. And that actually should go. So let's delete this and let's run the tests to see if that makes anything fail. It doesn't. Okay. Okay. And then, yeah. Okay. Delete obsolete, not obsolete, obsolete code. Okay. And then we can move this connection details stuff. We can move it. Actually, I'm going to copy it. Going to copy it to this SSH method. Okay. And this test runner ID, I think that can just be hard coded because we're never SSHing into anything but a test runner. So we can delete this and we can delete that. So then we can just have that. That's much simpler. Let's see if it still works. First of all, do the tests still pass? No, they don't. Okay. So SSH spec has failures. Okay, wrong number of arguments, right? Connection details. This might be a mess. Um, Maybe I did this connection details stuff for easier testing.
Might that be a
Hmm.
good place for a distinct private method for connection details? That way you could stub it in your tests.
Yeah, good question. Thinking. Thinking. Connection details. All right, maybe let's try that out.
You still need to bring in that ID as an argument.
Oh, yeah, thanks. That makes it a little bit nasty because then I need to do like that
Yeah,
adds a lot of noise.
does get littered pretty far.
Yeah. So here's another idea. Um, this SSH method is already kind of big. And I was about to say, what if we have a new object for this, but I already see we have this object called SSH session. I wonder what that's all about. Okay. Um, maybe instead of passing in what we're passing in, maybe it makes more sense to do something like this. Um, whoops. All right, I'm just gonna push around some code without worrying about like if what I do would actually work. Um, okay. Connection details. So what if, hmm, okay, connection details. So what if we just give the SSH session the connection details, and that's all? Um, okay, SSH session. Okay, so there's this connect method. Okay, that gets called at the end. Okay. Um, connect, and then what if at the beginning of connect we do this? So this, of course, becomes connection details. Oh, I forgot my closing parentheses. Okay, we'll get rid of these. Um, okay, the command is those two things. Whoops. Okay. Okay. Connection details. So I don't feel like it would be appropriate for SSH session to know anything about test runners. Um, okay.
Does connection details actually expose that?
No, I'm just saying the only reason I said that is because I wouldn't want to move this chunk into SSH session.
Makes sense.
Okay, so what have we accomplished in terms of figuring out what we might want to do? We moved this stuff into SSH session. And if that's good, why is it good? Well, before we had kind of a maybe a muddy division of responsibilities. Before there was a lot happening in this SSH method. There still is. There was even more happening in this SSH method. And it's like, okay, so this little piece of behavior waits for the VM to have an IP address. Um, and like, why should that be done outside the SSH session instead of inside the SSH session? There is an argument to be made that it should be done outside the SSH session. Why should the SSH session have to care about whether the VM's IP address is available or not? But anyway, let's assume we decide that it is appropriate for that stuff to happen in here. You know what I think that accomplishes? All right, so I'm going to blow away everything I just did. Not because I think it's bad, but I want to see what was there before. So let's talk about abstraction. Um, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of abstraction over the last few months, and I came up with kind of a definition, which is, if I recall correctly, something like abstraction is when you replace um, lower level ideas with higher level ideas in order to make part of a system easier to understand. Um, and right now, when you look at the SSH method, it's like just glancing at it for literally 1 second, it's like, what does it do? If you 1 second is not enough to tell, which tells me that this method doesn't have very good abstraction. We can improve the abstraction. Um, and I think this SSH session is probably a pretty good abstraction because this command here, that's a pretty low level detail. Um, it's definitely good to be able to just replace this low level detail with the higher level idea of command. Because it's like, I don't care exactly what the command is. I don't care about -o strict host key checking equals no or any of that stuff. I just need to know it's an SSH command. And for the SSH session, I give it the IP address to connect to. And for some reason oh yeah, I give it the RSA key path so that it can authenticate. Um, and I think it's appropriate um, for that abstraction, for the boundaries of that abstraction to lie where they do. I I think I'm of the opinion that it's not appropriate for the SSH session to deal with this concern of waiting for the VM's IP address to be available. that would make the abstraction harder to understand needlessly. Okay, so
May I throw some spaghetti?
please do.
So two things kind of come to mind for me looking at, like you said, just a quick overview of this method.
Mm-hmm.
One is that it looks like connection details is leaking internal implementation details
Mm.
with connection details that refresh.ip address.
Uh-huh.
And I wonder if that could be replaced with something along the lines of connection details.ready as a method name
Yeah.
that could abstract that away. The other thing that I'm seeing is it seems like you have a very good seam where you could extract a test runner class
Mm-hmm.
that could potentially encapsulate some of this,
I think you may
right?
well be right.
Because you could have your test runner class that's handling, like you have that patch method down on line 106 that could be uh, terminate on completion. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what that's actually doing down there. Um, but that can be a method call instead of what looks like an HTTP call at first glance.
Yeah.
Um, and then you could also have a builder method to build your connection details for that specific test runner. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
I think that does make sense. And another thing I'm realizing, and this isn't the first time I've had this thought, but like when you said the thing about this having too many implementation details available to us, I totally agree. And it makes me think that the connection details concept is maybe is maybe a little bit ill-conceived. Maybe there's a different abstraction there, um, that that serves us better. It's like, what exactly does connection details even mean? Hmm, okay, it's actually not super duper clear. Let's look at it again from the outside. So connection details gives us the IP address and RSA key path. Where does the IP address come from? So we're making a request to where? Test runners, test runner ID. So it's like the show page, the show endpoint for a test runner. Okay.
Now
So
you're actually getting the RSA key from DigitalOcean. Is that what I'm saying?
yeah, originally that's where it comes from. Well, yeah, I mean to be complete and precise, SaturnCI generates the RSA key, gives it to DigitalOcean, saves it in the database, and then we get it from the database. So I guess no, we're not getting it from DigitalOcean. We're getting it from the database. But this is just this CLI tool runs locally on my machine, and then it hits the Saturn CI server. In the local case, it's just going from my local machine and then it's hitting localhost 3000. But just to be clear that it's two different, it's a client server architecture. Um okay, so connection details, let's try something on for size for a second. What if instead of connection details, it was test runner? And then your idea is like until test runner dot ready to connect sleep one or whatever, that raises the level of abstraction a little bit. That seems better, right?
It does, but I still think the loop is probably a little too high level for here, right? Because like how does should the SSH method be worried about how many times we're going to retry that? Should it know how often we sleep before
It's a good point.
uh right? So I'd almost say like unless test runner ready to connect, raise no connection available.
Well,
Does
can't
that
be
make sense?
conditional because that'll almost always be false initially.
But we can move the loop into the test runner class, right? So the test
Right.
runner will do the waiting for you. And all you're doing is if you fail your retries, then it never becomes available. You return false.
Oh, I
If it
see.
succeeds, you return true. So it's going to block on that line until there's a valid connection, or the test runner decides I'm done retrying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Let's not even worry about uh a timeout failure yet. Um, um, because that's too much for me to hold my mind at once. Um, just for the waiting part, how might that go? Like, what would be the external API for that? I'm thinking like test runner dot wait for something.
You could do wait, or you could use ensure as a keyword there as well. Ensure connectable, something like that.
Hmm.
Maybe even with a bang so that it can raise by itself.
Well, I think it would be good to make it clear here that we're doing something that waits. To me, that waiting seems significant because if I'm, if my mental model of the way this method works is that it all just executes like, you know, fast, then that would be the wrong mental model in a way that I think is significant. So I think I want it to be clear that it's waiting some like non-trivial amount of time.
Good call.
Um, AI suggested wait for IP address. That seems something seems a little bit off about that to me because maybe it's more detailed than we care about and more detailed than we should care about. It's like we wait for it to be ready to connect to. We wait for it to be ready to accept connections.
Connectable. Is that even a word?
Sure.
Wait for connectable.
Um, Semantically, that makes sense, although it's grammatically invalid. So I object for that reason. I think we can do even better. I think we're on the right track, though. Um, okay, what is the okay? We're waiting for it to be we're waiting for it to be ready to connect to. So it's a virtual machine with a network interface, and it's like the network interface becomes ready. Is that a correct way of talking about it?
We could. Um, Another approach that I've dropped back to with AI, especially that might be appropriate here, is can we just throw in a fake verbiage there, run through implementation, and then see how we feel about it later? Does that make sense?
Um, it does make sense, but I feel like that's just kicking the can down the road, which is good sometimes. But I think um, in this case, this hard problem that we're trying to face might not be easier later.
Okay.
I think the problem that I'm having right now is I don't have a firm handle on what the domain concepts are that I'm dealing with. So it's imprecise to say that the VM is ready. Because it's not exactly that the VM's ready. We're waiting for some certain property of the VM to be ready. And, the language I used a minute ago was we're waiting for the VM's network interface to be ready. Maybe that's right, maybe it's not. I'm not sure. Um, we'll get by with a little help from our friends. Um, if I wait for a VM to be ready to SSH to, could I say that I'm waiting for the VM's network interface to be ready? Why or why not? Do you have any better ideas?
I feel like it read your mind on what you're trying to do with the SSH.
Huh, yeah. Okay, interesting. We're waiting for it to initialize network services. Huh. Okay, so even though you argued against it, and I think you had a good argument, I do want to go back to this for a second. And I don't want to say ready to connect. I want to say network services initialized. It allows us to use different language. All right, because like compare that with wait for network services to be initialized. I'm just looking at this and thinking about it. Hmm. I don't like either of these. Until test runner dot ready. Oh, ready for SSH? Okay. That feels like the exact right level of precision. Wait to be ready for SSH. Until test runner dot ready for SSH. Test runner dot wait to be ready for SSH. Okay. Um, I want to be very careful to be intellectually honest and have appropriate intellectual humility or whatever. So let's subject this idea to some scrutiny. Let's subject it to some criticism. Are there any reasons why we don't like this? Are there any, is there a way that would be better? And the answers can include things we've said already too. Can you shoot this down or poke any holes in it?
So I will say that the wait to be ready for SSH bugs me as being as being verbose
It's grammatically
is the main
awkward.
thing.
Yeah, I think it's not even the verbosity that bothers me. It's like a clumsy expression.
Yeah. Um, And, just breaking Yagni for a minute. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing that I do wonder is, will you, like this one in particular is very specific for SSH.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other places where you are waiting for that test runner to become available that is not specific to SSH, but will have the same criteria as being ready for SSH? Do you follow me on that?
I do. Um, I can't imagine any other scenario at the moment.
So, out of curiosity, forgive me as I've missed some of these.
Mm-hmm.
The How are you actually starting the test run? Are you calling into an API that's running on that machine, or are you SSHing to it?
Um, the test runner, when it gets provisioned, is loaded with an agent. That agent will then pull the SaturnCI server for an assignment. And then when it gets the assignment will include some data about the run, and then the agent will know how to initialize the run.
Okay. So, do we consider the test runner to be ready? Well, no, I guess that's not true. So, we would probably consider the test runner to be ready for SSH before the agent comes up. Because if the agent does not come up, we still need to be able to SSH to it easily. In which case, then I think the level of specificity of ready for SSH makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, it's just the clunky version of the verbiage of ready for SSH. Um, might it be better if we were to invert this a bit
Mm,
and try test runner dot SSH session dot wait for ready
interesting.
and have the test runner be responsible for building its own SSH session?
Interesting.
We're
Okay.
we're starting to build up cognitive context, but
Yeah, let's
might
try
that be
that
a better
out.
API?
Okay. Um, so at this point, it's like, I don't know, if we have the concept of testrunner.ssh session, then this like kind of doesn't reconcile with that, right?
Correct. We would essentially move that into the test runner, right?
Yeah. So what's currently called connection details will become test runner. Just gonna plop that there for a second. Um,
And then I was thinking on fly 96 to then add wait for ready on the end of it.
why should we even have to care about that? Because here it could just be like start the SSH session. Who cares how?
I'm okay with that. You had said when you were reading through this before that you wanted to see that this was not executing line by line, that there was a wait in there.
Well, I think if, if this becomes something as simple as this, then I think that desire goes away
Okay.
because then the thing I'm wanting to understand becomes different. Um, okay. But the API, of course, shouldn't just be testrunner.ssh session.
Yeah, I think you had like a connect down at the bottom or
I
something.
did have connect. So before it was ssh session.connect. Hmm. I'm not sure if I agree with my previous language choice. Because you don't connect the SSH session. I think you start the SSH session. Okay. Hmm. Okay. So this is now called test runner. And then we have a method called SSH session. And then what I was calling connect before is now called start. Okay. I think that like gets us where we want to be with that, but like I'm not gonna attempt that refactoring all in one fell swoop because that would just not work. Um,
I would caution against trying to change connection details directly to test runner.
mhm,
My thought on that is that right now in here, you're running specific commands against the test runner. You have the patch here, you have the get up above in the when you're building the connection details.
mhm,
And that feels like it could be a whole class by itself, with
mhm.
connection details being a subclass or an ancillary class next to it. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
connection details is maybe the what did we say it was? Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. It's like the network interface or something like that. Like connection details, like it has the signature of a name that somebody came up with just because they couldn't think of anything better, you know?
The same thing I suggested earlier.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so maybe that's like network interface or something like that. Um,
Does it make sense that what I was saying of basically like the connection details is a part of the information about a test runner, but the test runner itself feels like it might have additional context that's not specific enough?
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and so maybe it's something like test runner dot network interface dot IP address, where the test runner is a different concept and the test runner's network interface is a sub concept. That way, the test runner concept is more cohesive, and then the network interface concept is more cohesive too, and they can be
yeah,
understood separately.
yeah. I don't know if that'll hold out as you get through the implementation, but
Yeah, and not that this is important right now, but like testrunner.network.IP address. Hmm. I don't know. Anyway, I'll deal with that later. So in this entire session, it's about time to wrap up. In this entire session, we have made zero code changes, but that does not mean we haven't made progress. Um, Something I tell people a lot is like code isn't just a medium for creating a work product. It's also a medium for thinking. And like we did a lot of coding in this session. We just didn't commit anything. But just because we didn't commit anything doesn't mean we didn't get anything done. Um, our
I feel like
job,
that gets back to the Graham Bell "A Thousand Ways Not to Make a Light Bulb."
oh, interesting. Yeah. Um, because like our job as programmers is to design systems and and a big part of that is just thinking. Like we're thinking about what these components of the system are. Superficially, we're debating about names, but what we're really debating about is the concepts that compose the system. And that's really important. It makes all the difference between a good, sturdy, solid system that can be easily maintained over time and just a bunch of spaghetti code.
Yeah, I tend to fall back to, I forget, probably one of the ancient philosophers that said it. of it is amazing that I can put these words into a file, and my intent is to generate an image in your mind of what that thing is.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to craft at that image because your life your life experiences will generate a different image than mine with the same words.
Yeah, exactly. Um, okay, so we'll leave it there, and my next task will be to clean this up so that we can add the ability to conveniently delete a test runner so that I can more effectively diagnose this bug that I recently introduced. Okay, well, thanks, Jack, for joining me. Thank you, dear YouTube viewer, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you. Have a good one.